you've got suspense and you've got action, and I've found a good combination in the two Terminator films was to have a suspenseful build-up to an action release. In Terminator 2, you have a slow, tense build-up of these characters moving around, closing in on young John Connor, and then he sees the Terminator for the first time, and it's all in slow motion. And I like to use the slow motion in the build-up, where it has this kind of protracted, dreamlike or nightmarish quality, and then there's a cathartic break, and then it kicks into gear.
Get down.
Something is going right or something is going wrong, and you want to accentuate that. Rhythm is one of the ways you do that. You also want to create peaks and valleys in terms of rhythm.
Chases are a wonderful thing to work on as an editor. I wouldn't want to do them as a steady diet, but every now and then it's great fun. My favorite chase that I've ever worked on, actually, was the canal chase, as we called it, in Terminator 2.
Our ancestors were survivors, therefore we're here. And so there's something plugged into our reptilian hindbrain that makes us relate to the idea of being pursued and getting away. So we get to go through these kind of cathartic simulator runs when we watch a movie, and we get to experience that heart-pounding fear of being chased.
It's a natural form of excitement. Editing can hone that, sharpen that. The tempo of the cuts, the variety of shots that are used, the changing image sizes of characters, reactions, eyes. All these things are in the palette. By manipulation and juxtaposition, you can increase the excitement.
In the 1930s, movies became an even bigger business. The movie studios introduced sound films and radically reshaped movie making. Hollywood retooled itself on the model of the factory assembly line. The studios cranked out movies with almost the same speed that Henry Ford mass-produced cars. I don't want it good, Jack Warner declared. I want it Tuesday.
You now needed an industrial system to make this all work. In the first 20, 25, 30 years of cinema, large numbers of editors were women. It was considered to be a woman's job because it was something like knitting, it was something like tapestry, sewing, that you took these pieces of fabric, which is what film are, and you put them together. It was when sound came in that the men began to infiltrate the ranks of the editors, because sound was somehow electrical, it was technical, it was no longer knitting.
The advent of sound expanded the editor's role in Hollywood. During the 30s and 40s, directors rarely came into the cutting room. The editing was controlled by the studios and their supervising editors. One of the most powerful was Margaret Booth, supervising editor at MGM for 30 years. Mastering the transition to sound, she caught the attention of legendary producer Irving Thalberg, who was the first to call cutters film editors, starting with Booth herself.
She oversaw all the production and had a say in almost everyone. But Maggie was probably the toughest and most feared woman at MGM. I mean, people would shudder when they hear that she was on the phone, or she'd bust into the editing room, or you'd get a call, come down to room F, which is her room. You think, oh God, what have I done now? Margaret would tell the others, it's your responsibility for the pace of the movie, it's your responsibility to get the best performances out of your actors, it's your responsibility to make it as good as you can. Margaret Booth, she used to say, if I feel there's a cut at a certain spot, whether it matches or not, cut. And you cut, he says, for the emotion. And if you will get away with so much by doing that. And I would hear her really yell at different editors who would say, oh, it doesn't match. She said, I don't care. You know? Cut.
Booth, like other great studio editors of the era, helped create many of the stars of the golden age of Hollywood. Editors today are still doing the same.
We totally control the performance of an actor in the cutting room, actually. A lot of them won't admit that.
Most actors learn very early on that the editor is the one to make friends with, because their performance depends a great deal on the editor and the taste and the talent of the editor.
We'll see dailies, and take 5 is spectacular. It is great. But there's also something wonderful in take 7 and take 4 and take 3. Sometimes those and an actor will see it on screen and say, wow, that was terrific. You used take 5. They don't know, they don't realize that you are borrowing from every single performance. And the editor is the person who's responsible for finding those moments in each performance.
You talk about basic instinct. I think to a large degree the great performance that Sharon is giving there is also constructed by Frank. He spent an enormous amount of time in selecting every part of every take that he felt was important.
In cutting the interrogation sequence, using the basic scenes that were back and forth in the dialogue, the scene would be fairly dull. I had to create her looks and his looks. They were manufactured. They weren't really shot that way. I would take a piece of Michael looking at her from a different part of the scene and a piece of her looking at him from a different part of the scene.
I don't make any rules, Nick. I go with the flow.
Sharon asked if she could see it, and I said, yeah, it's done.
And Sharon came upstairs and said, you must remove that scene. And I said, what scene? And she says, you know the scene in the interrogation.
But they were all afraid, I think, that these shots would hurt her performance. And even Sharon, I think, still thinks now that she lost the Oscar nomination because of these shots.
And I said, Sharon, that scene is going to make you a star. And Paul said to her,
you shot it, you know what I was doing, and basically I like it. And it works.
And then, you know, that's history.
I always find the editor has more objectivity than the director, because the editor wasn't on the set. The editor didn't cast the movie. The editor didn't do the storyboards. The editor didn't inundate him or herself with a year and a half of pre-production. So the editor is the most, has the most objective eye in that creative environment.
I remember one night, I go over to Stephen's house in Poland. I said, Steve, I want to run this scene for you. And he says, he's okay, and I run the scene. He looks at me. He says, I'll see you in the morning. He walked out. He was so emotionally involved with the scene. He couldn't believe that he shot it. It was so real. We're all terribly affected by the film. There's something inside that takes over. But it's very emotional when there are problems in people's lives. Something emotional takes over that's beyond your conscious mind. And it seemed like an extreme example, but when you're editing that kind of film, you have to disassociate. You have to see each thing as a scene, and you build the scene and do the best you can with each scene. And then when it melds together, that's when you get the full force.
I think the scene in Schindler's List really illustrates the importance of emotion through film editing. It's the scene where they have a drink together, the first drink they've shared, because Stern has refused to drink with Schindler until this moment. There is just a pacing that is so emotional for me, so profoundly, deeply felt.
Someday, this is all going to end, you know. I was going to say we'll have a drink then.
I think I better have it now.
Mike Hahn's choices of how long to let the characters look at each other and study each other and think about how they're feeling. That was all done in the editing room. It wasn't in the script, and it wasn't on the floor the day I shot it. That whole emotional kind of meeting of the minds between those two great men happened in the editing room.
In dialogue scenes, I like people looking at each other. I like eyes to meet. So they're getting into each other and you're connecting.
Another way of looking at film editing is that it's a dance of eyes. Philip Seymour Hoffman's eye is looking, so that's a good thing. Now let's cut to a close-up of Hoffman looking, and the close-up of Hoffman is here. We've never seen this angle before, so the brain has to figure out what it's looking at and maybe why it's looking at it. And to the degree that you hold shots a certain length, you allow a certain train of thoughts to happen. When you cut a shot off, you've also cut off the thinking about that shot. Now, we want to cut to what he sees, because that's how we're going to understand what he's thinking about. Now there you see him thinking, and then his eye goes down. So let's rerun that at speed. Flinch, point of view, thinking, other co-conspirator. Let's do it now. What? Let's go. Oh, something's up. Let's don't do it. And we go. There's something about film, because of its sensory completeness, the fact that it is sound and image in this powerful fusion, that gets at something very deep within us.
Filmmakers realized that sound and image didn't just stimulate emotions, they could also influence beliefs. During World War II, the U.S. government enlisted Hollywood's best. Editors and directors brought with them the same techniques they had used in fiction films to stir audiences across America. The Hollywood recruits applied their skill to American propaganda films, such as Why We Fight. Both German and American political leaders recognized how powerfully sound and picture can manipulate audiences. One of the most infamous examples of film used for political propaganda was Triumph of the Will. Director Leni Riefenstahl used sound, music, and masterful editing to make Adolf Hitler into a god.
In uns marschiert Deutschland und hinter uns kommt Deutschland!
When the Allies went to war against Germany, British editor Charles Ridley re-edited the same footage to turn Hitler into a fool. Whether used for propaganda or entertainment, these techniques showed how powerfully editing could shape hearts and minds.
The manipulation of the elements within a film is a very powerful thing. It's almost a sacred thing, in a way, because you're creating effects, you're creating responses in the audience.
Editing is manipulation. We're manipulating reality as the audience sees it, because you want the audience to respond in a certain way. Whether it's a laugh, or a sigh, or a fright, everything's manipulated. And some people...
After World War II, Hollywood continued to make movies in the same way it had before the war. Although editors were now unionized, they were viewed for the most part as highly skilled mechanics.
There was a man named Owen Marks. He edited The Petrified Forest, Casablanca, Treasure of Sierra Madre, East of Eden, and his films are immortal, and the man is completely unknown. And it's sort of symbolic of the way editors have been ignored in the literature about Hollywood.
Editors worked on cutter's row and were expected to conform to the established rules of editing.
If we were to think about the films that were being made, there was a certain film language that was very, very distinct. Certain kinds of coverage, long shot, two shot, single. There was almost a formulaic way of presenting films. This film language was very strict. And in editorial terms, there were rules that one felt could not be broken.
A master shot had to come first, and then if you had an over-shoulder, you went to the over-shoulder, and you never went to the close-up.
You've got to remember is that a gentleman you meet among the cold cuts is simply not as attractive as one that you meet, say, in the mink department at Bird Dogs.
In the 40s and 50s,
The audience would expect the character to drive up, show him getting out of the car, he would walk up to the building, and then he would open the door, and then the editor would match cut the door opening on the other side, and he would walk in and come over and sit down.
Pull up a chair. Thanks. It just seemed to me absolutely stupid that you had to show somebody coming down the stairs and all the way across the road and up the other side. I mean, you knew that they were coming from here and they were going to there. Why couldn't you just cut directly?
Oh là là, Michel?
Je peux entrer?
Oui.
In France, a group of film critics turned directors also challenged the doctrine of invisible editing and launched a revolution among editors.
When I first saw the Nouvelle Vague, I instantly loved it. I loved the idea. I loved the way they edited and thought I would like to cut like that.
J'aime une fille qui a une très jolie nuque, de très jolis seins, une très jolie voix, de très jolis poignets, un très joli front, de très jolis genoux.
You know, Godard used jump cuts because it was like, well, why not? You know, there's nothing interesting happening in this middle part, so let's just go to a jump cut.
When I saw Breathless, I was staggered at Godard's brutality.
What they brought to editing was a breaking of the rules. Whatever books that said this is how it had to be done, they burned them.
Breathless is too hip for me. I come from Lower East Side. I'm an Italian-American guy. It's too beatnik. It's like, you know, bohemian. It's too cool. I liked it. I don't know what the hell was happening in it.
Je crois qu'il va me doubler, celui-là, donc ça frégate à la con.
You know, when I first saw Breathless in the 60s, it's like, wow. I mean, just in the first 5-minute sequence in introducing Jean-Paul Belmondo's character as this petty thief, I mean, every rule was violated in terms of how long to hold a shot, the discontinuity of what was going on, even screen directions, you know, were mixed in. And I felt like either this guy doesn't know what he's doing, or he's so confident that he has the grammar of film down that he's trying to show us a new way to use the material he has to tell the story.
There were some films that really changed our perception of what filmmaking was, and certainly it affected what editing was. I mean, I think one of those seminal films is certainly something like Bonnie and Clyde.
Some people say I broke those rules first. I certainly did not. I mean, the Russians broke those rules, and the Germans broke those rules. This was nothing new, but it was new for Hollywood.
Several editors have had big impacts on me, have influenced my thinking. Dede Allen certainly is one who has taught me that. Don't be afraid to take a chance on doing something that doesn't seem like it's going to work. When Beatty and Faye Dunaway get to know each other, they're standing on the street corner, and she says, "I don't believe you robbed banks." And he said, "Yes, I do. Look at my gun." And he pulls it out and holds it to her on the street corner. And that could easily have been done with the tilt down to the gun, the pan over to her hands fidgeting with a Coke bottle, up to her face. But it was done in her eyes look from him down, gun, back to him. It keeps you on edge. There's the excitement, there's the danger, there's the eroticism in not being able to fully get every moment because you're cutting it off and you are not allowing the moment to come to fruition.
Bonnie and Clyde was much more violent than anything we'd done because basically the Americans like violence much more than we do.
Well, it was shot in so many wonderful ways because this is the scene that Arthur intended to be cut in this fashion. The fact that it was so beautifully executed right from the very first cut. Jerry Greenberg was my assistant, and on the last scene, I left Jerry alone with that scene, and he did all the primary editing on that. All I did was tighten it later.
So they're going up, trying to get away from him before he catches them. Then the cavalry come around the corner. In the end, there will be probably 5,000 shots in the film, and all of them have to be ultimately be the right shot in the right place for the right length of time.
Another change in editing is the accelerated pace of movies, a subject of controversy among filmmakers.
An encounter with two swords 30 years ago would have been probably done in a master shot and a couple of exchanges. Today, that encounter could evolve into 200 shots. Split second, eye blink, a blade going into a chest, slight movement of the wrist. So the audience is taken right down into this roller coaster ride of minutiae, and that's what they want.
Because kids today are raised on television, in MTV and commercials, they not only can process information faster and understand what images mean, but that they demand it.
And I mean, fast cutting was not invented now or with MTV. Just look at Lou Lombardo's work on Wild Bunch.
Sometimes a cutting style is effective inside of a movie to shake you up and rattle your soul, but consistently to have that style pounding away at you like a metronome on high speed for 2.5 hours is a little bit, at least for me, maybe I'm just getting old, but it's a little bit debilitating. Now, it doesn't bother my kids, because my kids were raised on 30-second commercials and on MTV and VH1, and they were raised on video games.
I feel like I was born 80 and I'm growing backwards. So now I'm somewhere around 27, you know, I get a tattoo and I'm feeling closer to a generation that has learned to absorb information at a speed that was heretofore unthinkable, and where their rhythms are well more hungry than a traditional narrative pace.
What I'm afraid of is the tendency for everything to go by quickly. And I'm afraid of what it does to the culture. A sense of consuming something and throwing it away, as opposed to being enveloped with something. Taking the time to see and experience time in a different way.
First, one understands that he causes much of his own suffering needlessly. Second, he looks for the reasons for this in his own life. To look is to have confidence in one's own ability to end the suffering. Finally, a wish arises to find a path to peace. For all beings desire happiness. All wish to find their purer selves.
In many ways, we're the last storyteller. The movie's been written by the writer, and then it's directed, and then it comes to the last storytelling, which is in the editing process.
The last draft of the screenplay is the first cut of the movie, and the final cut of the movie is the last draft of the script.
An editor can take a sequence that a director shot and reconfigure it in such a way that it becomes a whole different sequence, which is much more beneficial to the movie.
Obviously, great directors give you great material to work with, but the ultimate film that you see is the edited version, and it's the editor is greatly responsible for that.
I find my work absolutely fascinating and absorbing. I sat down to work, and 30 years went by without my noticing it.
It's true. When I go into an editing room in the morning, I edit. My assistant has to remind me it's lunchtime. Or Steven has to come in and say, hey, Mike, why don't you stop for a while or something? Because time goes by like that. You're building a whole other world. You're building a whole construct.
There's a joy on one level in that it's very much like putting a puzzle together. I have thousands and thousands of pieces, and how do I tell the story? And this goes before that, no, that doesn't. Or actually, I only need half of that.
The job is not unlike the Talmudic scholar who goes and sits and argues about the book over and over again, always coming up with new answers that are just more subtly refined than the last answer.
To sit in the theater at a preview and to hear an audience laugh at that moment when you expect to laugh and it comes back at you, or to hear an audience shuffling and crying because it's so sad and you expect that moment to really happen that way, that's so marvelous. It tells you what power we have.
I believe in people's being able to learn, because otherwise, what's the point? We're all going to, be past one of these days. And how are we going to take this fantastic thing called film and motion pictures and storytelling unless we pass it on and teach people how to do it?
In the century since Edwin Porter introduced editing, editors have emerged from their dimly lit back rooms. Once anonymous men and women, they have gradually become principal collaborators in the filmmaking process. The best-kept secret in the movies, the editor, is finally out.
The Oscar goes to...